Okay, we're going to go ahead and pick it back up. And we're going to pick it back up with verse 2. As soon as I get this right screen up. So verse 1, consequently, Christ having suffered in the sphere of the flesh, you also equip, arm yourselves with the same thought, insight, way of thinking. Because the one having suffered in the sphere of flesh has ceased from sin. There's a comma that didn't end. Okay, and now we're going to go in verse 2. And what we're going to see is that verse 2 and 3 start a section that give us orientation once again to the will of God. And of course, this will of God is associated with this emphatic area, the same thought, insight, way of thinking. That is clearly tied to the will of God. So we're going to see that. Peter is going to focus on these next two verses on making sure we understand how to function properly and how to understand the will of God. Okay? Verse 2 is a pretty hard verse to exegete because there was a lot of hyperbaton. The words themselves were in all kinds of order. What I had to do was sit there and go through the parts of speech and make sure that I got it in the right order. Okay, I'm not going to suffer you guys through all of that and give it to you literally, and then because literally, if you went through it literally, it will not make a lot of sense. So I'm just going to give it to you as it's the end result, if you will. But you will see that there's going to be some underlining and double underlining. And I know the double underlining doesn't necessarily show up on the screen here, but I will tell you exactly where it occurs. Okay? So it's a very short verse, actually. We start off, and it's starting with a lower case because we're just continuing the sentence. So we started here, suffered in the sphere of the flesh, has ceased from sin. And then we have, so as to no longer live, and live is underlined. And we start here with the preposition eis, E-I-S. Eis has the basic meaning in, into, toward, or to. But then it's extended as a marker of degree to mean up to or to the end. And then it's further extended when used to represent the result of an action or a condition indicated, like we have here. It means into, to, so that, or so as to. And of course, the latter is the way I've translated it. It fits the verbiage here better. So as to, that all comes from eis. Okay. Then we have an adverb I don't think we've seen in a while, if we've ever seen it, and it's meketi. M long E, K short E, T I. Meketi. And meketi means no longer, or not from now on, as Art Gangrick Danker said it. And the idea here is no longer, meaning to cease an action that is currently in process. So it doesn't mean so that you don't ever have to do this. It means so that you are no longer, okay, to stop doing something until you've learned this information, or once you've learned this information. Going forward, you are not supposed to do this, okay? So you no longer, and that's obviously the way I've translated it, so as to no longer. Then we have our first hyperbaton. This is the verb. It's being modified, and it's actually the word, it's being modified by the adverb meketi, but there's 10 words in between them. So that tells you how jumbled up this actual verse was. The verb that goes with the adverb was 10 words away, and that gives you the hyperbaton, that gives you the emphasis for this word, live. And the word is actually the aorist active indicative of the verb be'ao. Be'ao, B, little I, or short I, short O, long O. Be'ao. And be'ao should look familiar. It's the word that we get our English word biology and other related words meaning the study of life. Okay? This word means to live. And of course, it's synonymous with zao, which we've seen many, many times, D-Z-A-O, zao. Zao means to live. It's cognate of, obviously, of zoe, which means life as an intensive existence. But the difference here is that be'ao means to live a pattern of life. It actually means, even though in English we use it as the study of life from a physical perspective, here it actually means the function of the soul. So it's living life based on the information in your soul. That's what be'ao means. Zao means exercising the function of life in using the body. So life has an intensive existence with the use of the body. Okay? So that's why we have a different word. Ba'o is taking us back to, that's why I said the underlying part of verse 1, the insight part of it is underlined and emphasized, and Peter keeps that emphasis by using this word instead of zao. He's talking about having that insight, having that mind of Christ. Okay? Here the aorist tense gives us the idea that this is taking place in phase 2, or time. It's your whole life. From now forward, you're supposed to live your life as you're going to see here. And that means the mental attitude of your life, the soul life that you have going forward is what you're supposed to get. The active voice tells us that the believer produces the action of this mental attitude and this function of life. And of course, the word being in the wrong place, in other words, 10 words away from the adverb, gives us emphasis, so we've underlined it. So far we've started off so as to no longer live. Then we have the remaining time in the flesh. The remaining time in the flesh. And this phrase starts with the masculine accusative singular of the adjective epiloipos. Epiloipos, E-P-I-L-O-I-P-O-S. And epiloipos means a part that remains from the whole. When you eat all of the pie and you have one slice of pie left, or you've eaten all but one slice, it's the epiloipos. Okay, it's that part that remains. And here we're talking about remaining. And actually this word is only used once in the New Testament, and so you can guess where. Okay, so it's here. So it means remaining. And this word is modifying the masculine accusative singular of a noun we've seen many times before, chronos. C-H-R-O-N-O-S, chronos. And chronos is a word that we've seen. Chronos is a word that finds its way into the English quite a bit. And like I've said before, as you have kids, one of the things you want to make sure you teach your kids is a lot of Greek roots and Greek prefixes and suffixes along with the Latin prefixes and suffixes, and they will have a tremendous vocabulary. Okay, well, chronos means time. It's what we get in English. We have chronometer, we have chronograph. All of those things measure time. Here it means an indefinite period of time during which some activity or event takes place. It's a period of time. And of course here it refers to the time that the believer has on the face of earth after he or she has heard this passage. So it's the rest of the time, right? The remaining time. And then next we have the condition in which the believer is now spending this time. The idea being phase 2. In phase 2, how do we spend our time? We spend it in the flesh. And we start with the preposition en, meaning in, inside of, or within. And then we have the feminine dative singular of the articular noun sarx, which we've seen before, S-A-R-X-Z, sarx. And sarx is a noun that we're very familiar with. It's used to mean the material that covers the bones of the human or animal body. It means flesh, okay, when used just literally. When used biblically, it also includes flesh with the emphasis on the old sin nature. So what we're seeing here is Peter getting double action out of this word, and we'll get that when we do the analysis, but Peter is very clever. You wouldn't think about it, you wouldn't think that way, knowing Peter's original roots, where he was kind of a very brutish fisherman. Didn't have much of a vocabulary, but his palling around with Paul, as well of course with his inspiration associated with the God, the Holy Spirit, we get two meanings coming out of this. We're talking about the remaining time in the flesh, in other words, your existence here on earth, as long as you're in flesh, as long as you're in the body. But then he's also talking about the rest of the time in flesh, meaning while you're in that body and you have the old sin nature constantly tweaking you, constantly trying to provoke you, constantly trying to make you function improperly. You are not supposed to live the remaining amount of your time while you're in that flesh, in the flesh. Okay, while you're in that body, in the sin of the old sin nature and the flesh. It's really a very, very concise way of doing it. And we know this because of the very next phrase. So the remaining time in the flesh to the lust of men, and that's single underlined, to the lust of men, comma. So what are the lusts of men? Well, the lust of men is that pattern of the old sin nature, the lust pattern of the old sin nature, your particular lust pattern. See, some people, the lust pattern is for sexual gratification, for sexual malfunction. For others, it's to be holier than thou. The lust pattern is to try to beat everybody down by being the church lady, if you will, that Saturday Night Live used to have. Wow, isn't that special? I would never do anything like that because I am so godly, right? I look down at you and down my nose because you are sinners, and I am this fantastic person who's walking on water only ankle deep. Okay, I'm so much better than you, and I wish you could come up and attain my level of perfection, but I know you won't because I am so much better. See, that's just as much of a lust pattern as the lust pattern of the person that's hitting all the bars trying to get the working women. Okay, and in fact, the person that's hitting the bars and trying to get the working women is usually more honest about what he's doing than the person who's fooled themselves into thinking that they are holier than everybody else. And the only way sometimes that person understands that they are in a lust pattern is when they get smacked down by someone who's functioning properly. But anyway, that's the lust pattern of men. Whatever that lust pattern is in your particular area of weakness or your area of strength. Remember, your area of strength is also a part of the old sin nature. And in those individuals, for example, that are trying to be holier than thou, that may be their area of strength. They used to be a properly functioning believer, perhaps, and now they are thinking they are greater than everybody else. Okay? That's the lust of men. It's underlined. It's totally out of place and in the wrong spot, so therefore it's emphasized by hyperbaton. And we start here with the feminine dative plural. So I should have actually said to the lusts of men. Okay? But lust is a plural group. Okay, plural of the noun we've seen before, epithumia, E-P-I-T-H-U-M-I-A. Epithumia. And epithumia originally meant a great desire for something, whether it was proper or improper. It meant a desire, a longing, or a craving. Again, for something proper or improper, like the little kid desiring Christmas. There's usually nothing wrong with a little kid desiring for Christmas unless they start malfunctioning as a result of that, although usually little kids will start trying to be on their best behavior while they are lusting for Christmas. Okay, but it's extended to mean lust. It's extended to mean desire for something forbidden or simply improper. It becomes a craving or a lust. And remember, lust is always wrong, no matter where you find it. You are not supposed to lust after your right man or right woman. You're supposed to have proper desire. You can have an intense desire, but not a lust. When it becomes a lust, then it's sinful. Okay? This is the dative of disadvantage. It is the disadvantage of the believer to have this kind of lust, to be able to be in this old sin nature and functioning improperly with this lust. This lust is then paired with the masculine genitive plural, the plural again, of the noun anthropos. A-N-T-H-R-O-P-O-S, another word we've seen. And another root for our English words, we have anthropology, which started off as the study of mankind. It didn't really start off as a store that sold icky things or decent things, depending on what you like. Okay, but anyway, anthropology was the study of mankind. And here it means a person of either sex with focus on participating in the human race. It means a human being or mankind in general. Here in the genitive, we get the of, and of course in the plural we get of men. So to the lust, and let's go ahead and change that since it was plural, and oops. Change that to the lusts of men. Okay? And that whole thing is underlined. So far we have so as to no longer live. That means soul life. The remaining time in the flesh means phase 2, and while we're in the flesh with the old sin nature. To the lust of men, underline comma. And if we're not supposed to live to that, then what are we supposed to live to? And we have the very last phrase in the verse, but, underline comma, to the will of God, period. And you probably can't see that back there, but this is double underlined. It's not just a shadow, it's double underlined. It is emphasized tremendously because this phrase, or the majority of that phrase, is at the very, very, very beginning of verse 2. It's the first couple words in verse 2. So the way Peter wrote this, you first are focusing on the will of God, which is focusing on the emphasis that he had before, which was associated with the mind of Christ. Okay? But to the will of God. And this last phrase starts, like I said, with starts with the strong conjunction of contrast, Allah, A-L-L-A, which we see many times. It means but also D-E means but. Well, this one is the strong conjunction, therefore we always identify it by underlining it, and we follow it with a comma, but, underline, comma. Then we have the phrase that's double underlined. It's, like I said, it's moved all the way to the front of the verse, so it's being doubly emphasized, and we start with the neuter dative singular of the noun thelema, T-H-E-L, long E, M-A, thelema. And thelema means something that one wishes to happen. It means what is willed. And here, it's referring to the perfect will of God. And therefore, this dative is a dative advantage, as it's to the advantage of the believer to do the will of God. And so the dative gives us the to, and so we have to the will. And then lastly, we have the masculine genitive singular of what we'd expect, theos. T-H-E-O-S, meaning God with emphasis on his deity. And therefore, in the genitive, we have of God. And this whole thing is double underlined. Or if you don't have the capability of doing double underline, I would do an underline with a bold. And what this is telling us is that it's the will of God giving us possession. It's the will of God that we are to be living in. We are not to be living in the lusts of the flesh in which we reside, but instead in the will of the God which we can reside in mentally and then function properly. So altogether, verse 2, see, told you it wasn't very long. Verse 2 says, and I'll fix it here too. Yeah, go away. So as to no longer live the remaining time in the flesh to the lusts of men, but to the will of God. And that last phrase again is double underlined. I wish it had come out better, but it doesn't. So now we're ready for the analysis. Point 1. Verses 2 and 3 are going to give us another orientation to the will of God. This, of course, is related to the previous verses on suffering circumstances. with the point that the purpose for suffering circumstances this is related to the previous verses of suffering circumstances with the point that the purpose for suffering circumstances is namely so that the human volition should comply with God's volition resulting in the believer performing the will of God, period. See, so the idea is that if you're suffering, you're obviously not in God's will, and you're undergoing discipline to get you back into God's will. See, the suffering or the suffering circumstances get you to focus on God's will. What does he want me to do right now? Well, if you're suffering, what he wants you to do is get back in fellowship and get aligned and start doing his will. If you aren't suffering and it's suffering circumstances, then what? Then you have the point to be able, once again, focus on God. Why do I have these suffering circumstances? What am I learning from it? How do I apply his information? And once again, what? You are implementing God's will. So the whole idea from Peter's perspective, from what we're supposed to understand, is that both suffering and suffering circumstances are made such that you will do the will of God. Give you the best opportunity to do the will of God. And that's where the maximum grace blessings come from. When you are performing God's will, you are being blessed. When you are not performing God's will, you're under divine discipline. So what do you want to be? You want to undergo divine discipline, or you want to have blessing? Well, to have blessing, you have to do the will of God. That means you have to stay in fellowship, you have to know what the will of God is for your life, and you have to focus on making sure that you perform that using the power of God, the Holy Spirit. Remember, my burden is easy. Sure. What's that? Thank you. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. I don't know what happened there. All of a sudden I had a void in my memory, okay? But my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The idea is that you don't have to do it on your own. To stay in God's will, you use God's power, and it is a piece of cake because it takes absolutely nothing from you. To be out of God's will is what takes the energy, because now you're fighting God's discipline. You're swimming upstream, so to speak. See, one of the things that Chris and I learned years ago when we learned how to do trout fishing, of course we didn't learn how to catch very often, but one of the things we learned, right, is that fish are essentially lazy. One of the things that trout fishing relies on. See, people tend to think fish swim around and they eat things. Well, trout don't. Trout hide behind the rocks and in the place where the stream isn't, washing them all the way, and they can just kind of sit there and, flap their little fins, right, and then when they see something kind of floating by, then they go out into the current and they let it float right into their mouth, and then they go back into the eddy, into where there's no current, right? So they have a pretty easy life. They're not sitting there swimming upstream all the time. They're not fighting the stream. They're hiding behind the rocks, and they pull out, and they get their food, and they go back in. Well, that's the kind of life we're supposed to have as believers. See, we're supposed to let God do the work. We're supposed to be in God's plan. We're in the stream. We're in the right stream. We're facing the right direction. We're moving the way we're supposed to move. And we let God bring the blessing to us. And we let God do the work. We don't have to sit there and fight the current and fight the stream to try and get our blessing. Okay, we don't need to be swimming around upstream trying to get strong and prove how great we are. We sit back, we hide behind the rock in the divine dynasphere, function properly, and let God handle things for us and give us grace. We do what we're supposed to do. In other words, the fish has to go out there once in a while, right, and get the food. Well, God tells us we got to do certain things once in a while. It's our responsibility, but we have the power of God to do it. And that's what we're getting here. Okay? If you're challenged and tested in order to get focus on your status, you're challenged and tested in order to get you to focus on your status and orientation to God's will. And if you're suffering, you're not in God's will, and you're undergoing divine discipline to get back into His will. And if you're suffering, you have suffering circumstances, you're currently in God's will and being focused on that through the circumstance. So either way, suffering or suffering circumstances is associated with the will of God. Point 2. In verse 3, Peter will explain for us the improper type of life he is referring to here. But he does not do that now. Because he does not want to detract from the focus of God's will which he is setting up. See, what we're going to see in verse 3 is the way that these individuals are currently living, which is not in the will of God. But rather than start taking the time and saying, don't live, so as to no longer live the remaining time in the flesh like this, blah, 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 blah. He's going to give specifics in verse 3, but he's not doing it now because he wants to get the will of God in here first. He wants us to focus on the way we're supposed to live, and then he's going to explain what these individuals are doing. And preview of coming attractions, what you're going to see is that these individuals, who, as you remember, for all the way back from the first chapter of Peter, are saved Jews, you're going to see that they threw out the Mosaic law in all of their Judaism to become believers, but like so many people, they went too far, right? Like the individual who's been under a very strict parent, and now all of a sudden they're out on their own for the very first time, and they go haywire and go way too far. That's what these Jews are doing, and we're going to see that instead of acting properly like Christians, they're acting like unbelieving type Christians and going, woo-hoo, we're no longer associated with the law, therefore we're going to go do all kinds of things, right? And that's obviously not right. Point 3. The phrase, quote, no longer live, of course live is underlined, end quote, means that the believer is to no longer follow the same pattern of life comma, which in this case is, quote, thought life or soul life, emphasized by the word be'ao, comma, So without the ellipsis, we have the believers to no longer follow the same pattern of life. And then we have comma, that ellipsis, comma, that he did, so continuing the point, that he did before his acceptance of Christ's work on the cross. Continue the point. The word be'ao is in the aorist active indicative. With the aorist holding up the action as an event. Which here emphasizes phase two or life. As a period of time. And the active voice tells us that the believer is to produce the action of having the proper mental attitude. And finally, the indicative mood is the mood of reality. Which reinforces that the believer is to have the mind of Christ under the filling of the Holy Spirit. I actually have all of these as points. Actually, I had time last night to put points up, and I forgot to put them up. So point 1 was verses 2 and 3, focused on the will of God. Point 2, obviously, the main point tells us Peter's going to explain the proper form of living in verse 3. And number 3 was that the believer is to change his thought pattern. Point 4, which will be the last point we get today. Point 4 says, then the phrase, comma, the remaining time, comma, quote, the remaining time, comma, end quote. Okay, then the phrase, comma, quote, the remaining time, comma, end quote, comes from the word epiloipos, that's E-P-I-L-O-I-P-O-S, epiloipos. Meaning the elapse of time. Or here, the rest of the time you have after getting smart from this passage. The idea sorry, I'm having a little bit of a technical problem here. Okay. The idea is that now that you know better, you are to start a new way of life. Period. You are going to be held responsible from this time forward to have the proper mental attitude and knowledge to function properly in the will of God. See, remember that when we studied rebound, and you know rebound, and the passage in 1 John 1:9 tells us that God is going to forgive us the sins of things that we don't know are sin. See, God's going to hold us. He holds us accountable for everything that we would malfunction in. But he doesn't punish us for the things that we don't necessarily know, or those things that we don't know are sin. He handles through rebound. If you keep short accounts, he handles through rebound those things that you don't know as sin. But the idea is that you continue to grow, and pretty soon you learn those things are sin. The examples that we always like to fall on is that many believers don't understand that fear is a sin, that anxiety is a sin, that worry is a sin. They all show the lack of trust in God. They all show a mental attitude focused on you rather than God. Those kinds of things, you start to learn as sin, and then guess what? Once you learn them, you're responsible and held accountable. Well, that's what we have here. Now we're learning we have to be in the will of God, and we're going to be held accountable for not living in the will of God. And that's exactly what this verse is telling us. And so those individuals that say, well, I don't know what God's will is, therefore I can't be held accountable. Well, he tells you right here, you better know the will of God, because once you know that you're supposed to know it, you are going to be held accountable. Now you have no excuse. Okay? And that's where we're going to go. So we'll be ready to pick up with point 5 next week. At this point, we're going to go ahead, as always, and close with a song. So if you'll stand. We are going to sing song, sorry about that, I should have told you. We're going to sing song number 40.